The slap echoed through Coastal Kitchen like a gunshot, silencing every conversation in the packed restaurant. Vivian Grace Morrison sat frozen, her hand instinctively moving to her reddening cheek as her wire-rimmed glasses clattered to the marble floor. 7 months pregnant and glowing despite her exhaustion. She stared across the white linen tablecloth at her husband Charles, whose face remained cold and calculating even after striking her in front of 50 witnesses. "Pick them up," Charles Edward Whitmore III commanded in the same tone he used with subordinates at his investment firm. His steel gray eyes held no remorse, only irritation that she had forced his hand. "And stop making that pathetic face. People are staring." The upscale restaurant had fallen eerily quiet except for the soft jazz playing over hidden speakers and the gentle crash of waves against the rocks outside. Coastal Kitchen sat perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views that normally made this the most sought-after reservation in town. Tonight, those windows reflected the stunned faces of diners who had witnessed something that would haunt them for weeks. Vivian's hands trembled as she bent forward awkwardly, her pregnant belly making the simple task of retrieving her glasses nearly impossible. The baby kicked frantically inside her, as if responding to her elevated heart rate and the surge of adrenaline coursing through her system. She had felt this before, the way her unborn child seemed to sense danger, even from within the safety of her womb. "Happy anniversary to us," Charles murmured, straightening his Italian silk tie and reaching for his wineglass as if nothing had happened. At 38, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Old money family, Ivy League education, corner office with harbor views, and a pregnant wife who had learned to keep her mouth shut. Until tonight. The evening had started like so many others over their 3 years of marriage. Charles had chosen the restaurant, ordered for both of them without consulting her preferences, and spent the first course detailing her failures as a wife and soon-to-be mother. Her weight gain during pregnancy disgusted him. Her inability to keep up with his social obligations embarrassed him. Her suggestion that she might need to take maternity leave earlier than planned had triggered his coldest rage. "The doctor said the stress levels could affect the baby," Vivian had whispered, hoping to make him understand. "My blood pressure has been elevated, and she's concerned about preterm labor if I don't slow down." Charles had gripped her wrist under the table then, his manicured fingers pressing against her pulse point until she gasped. "You will work until this baby comes, and you will do it with a smile on your face. Do you understand me? I will not have my wife looking weak in front of my colleagues and clients." That was when she had made her mistake. Instead of nodding and apologizing like she had been trained to do over months of systematic conditioning, Vivian had found a spark of her old self buried deep beneath layers of fear and compliance. "I am not your employee, Charles. I am your wife, and I am carrying your child. I deserve some consideration and respect." The words had hung in the air between them for exactly 3 seconds before his palm connected with her cheek. Now, as she finally managed to retrieve her glasses with the help of a concerned waiter, Vivian became aware of the phones pointed in their direction. In an age where everything was recorded and shared instantly, Charles had just destroyed any chance of maintaining his carefully crafted public image. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized he did not care. The mask had finally slipped completely. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance," Charles announced to the room, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling narratives. "My wife is having some difficulty with her pregnancy hormones. I am sure you all understand." The collective intake of breath was audible, even in a room full of wealthy, powerful people who were accustomed to overlooking uncomfortable truths. Charles had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Several women pushed back from their tables, hands moving protectively to their own bellies or reaching for their companions. Vivian felt the familiar shame washing over her, the voice in her head that Charles had carefully cultivated, telling her this was somehow her fault. She should not have spoken back. She should not have embarrassed him in public. She should have been more careful, more submissive, more grateful for the privilege of carrying his heir. But the baby kicked again, harder this time, and something deeper than fear stirred in her chest. This tiny person growing inside her did not deserve to enter a world where violence was explained away as hormonal difficulties. This child deserved better than a father who solved problems with his fists and a mother too afraid to protect them both. "Charles," she said quietly, her voice stronger than she felt. "I think we should go home. We will leave when I decide we leave," he replied, cutting into his perfectly prepared duck breast as if the last 5 minutes had not occurred. "And you will finish your meal and act like the grateful wife you are supposed to be." That was when Vivian noticed him approaching their table. Clayton Mitchell Grace moved through the dining room with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent years navigating war zones and hostile territory. At 32, her older brother still carried himself like the Navy SEAL he had been before trading his military career for Chef White's and a dream of opening his own restaurant. His dark hair was shorter than military regulation, but longer than he had worn it overseas, and his green eyes held the kind of focused intensity that made smart people step aside and stupid people make very bad decisions. Clay had built Coastal Kitchen from nothing, transforming a rundown seafood shack into the most prestigious restaurant on the Central Coast through sheer force of will and culinary genius. He treated his staff like family, his customers like honored guests, and his sister like the most precious thing in his world. Tonight, he looked like he was preparing for war. "Vivian," Clay said softly as he reached their table, his voice carrying the controlled calm that any veteran would recognize as a warning signal. His eyes moved quickly over her reddened cheek, her trembling hands, her defensive posture, cataloging evidence with the efficiency of someone trained to assess threats and respond accordingly. "Clayton, how wonderful to see you," Charles replied smoothly, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. "Congratulations on another excellent meal, though I have to say, the service has been somewhat lacking tonight." Clay's gaze never left his sister's face. "Vivian, are you all right?" The simple question, asked with such gentle concern, nearly broke her resolve to hold everything together. Clay had always been her protector, even when they were children. He had taught her to ride a bike, scared away bullies, and held her when their father died too young. He had walked her down the aisle at her wedding because no one else could have filled that role, though she now wondered if he had seen warning signs even then. "She is fine," Charles answered for her, his tone sharp with the authority of ownership. "And I would appreciate you returning to your kitchen so we can finish our anniversary dinner in peace." Something shifted in Clay's expression, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that Vivian had seen only once before, during their father's funeral, when a drunk mourner had made inappropriate comments about their mother's grief. It was the look of a man whose patience had reached its absolute limit. "Sir," Clay said, and the single word contained volumes of restrained violence, "I was not speaking to you." The tension at the table crackled like electricity before a storm. Charles set down his fork with deliberate precision, the small clink against his plate somehow more ominous than if he had thrown it across the room. Around them, the restaurant had grown so quiet that the sound of waves against the rocks below seemed unnaturally loud. "Excuse me," Charles asked, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. "Did you just tell me what I can and cannot say about my own wife?" Clay's hands remained steady at his sides, but Vivian could see the subtle shift in his stance, the way his weight balanced on the balls of his feet like he was preparing to move. She knew that stance from their childhood, from the countless times he had positioned himself between her and whatever threatened to hurt her. "I asked my sister a question," Clay replied evenly. "I would like to hear her answer." "Your sister," Charles laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Let me explain something to you. Chef, when a woman gets married, she becomes part of her husband's family. Her loyalty, her obedience, her very identity belongs to him. Vivian is my wife, which means she answers to me, not to some glorified short-order cook who thinks wearing Chef Whites makes him important." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Vivian watched her brother's face, seeing the muscle in his jaw twitch once, twice, before going perfectly still. She had seen Clay angry before, had watched him lose his temper as a teenager and young man. But this was different. This was the cold, calculated fury of someone who had learned to channel rage into deadly precision. "Charles, please," Vivian whispered, finally finding her voice. "Let's just go home." "We are not going anywhere," he snapped, turning his attention back to her with renewed viciousness. "You wanted to make a scene in front of your brother, fine. Let him see exactly what kind of wife he raised you to be." Charles leaned forward across the table, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the now silent restaurant. You have been nothing but a disappointment since the day I married you. Weak, emotional, constantly complaining about every little thing. I thought pregnancy might make you more grateful, more feminine, but instead you have become even more pathetic. Each word hit Vivian like a physical blow, designed to strip away whatever confidence she had managed to gather. She could feel the baby moving restlessly inside her, responding to her stress and elevated heart rate. The doctor had warned her about this, about how maternal distress could affect fetal development and potentially trigger early labor. You think carrying my child gives you some kind of power over me? Charles continued, his voice growing louder as he sensed her weakness. Let me remind you of something. Sweetheart, I own you. I own this pathetic little life you think you have built. Your job, your apartment before we married, your car, your clothes, everything you touch belongs to me. And when this baby comes, I will own them too. That's enough. Clay's voice cut through Charles's tirade like a blade through silk. Charles straightened in his chair, his face flushing with indignation. I beg your pardon. I said that's enough. Clay took a single step closer to the table, and somehow that small movement seemed to fill the entire space around them with potential violence. You will not speak to my sister that way in my restaurant or anywhere else. Your restaurant, Charles laughed again, and this time the sound was genuinely amused. Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand what I could do to this little vanity project of yours with a single phone call? He pulled out his phone and held it up like a weapon. I have connections you cannot even imagine. Health inspectors, fire marshals, liquor licensing boards, food critics who could destroy your reputation overnight. I could have this place shut down by morning and ensure you never work in this industry again. The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had wielded such power many times before. Charles Edward Whitmore III came from the kind of old money family that owned judges, bought politicians, and crushed opposition with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. He had never encountered a problem that could not be solved with money, influence, or intimidation. But as he looked into Clay's eyes, something cold and predatory looked back at him. You know what I think, Clay said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather or the evening specials. I think you have never been in a fight in your entire life. I think you have spent so many years picking on people who cannot fight back that you have forgotten what real danger looks like. He moved closer, each step measured and deliberate. The other diners were no longer even pretending to eat, phones out and recording, as the confrontation escalated beyond anything they had ever witnessed in person. I think, Clay continued, his voice never rising above a normal speaking level, that you hit my pregnant sister because you knew she could not hit you back. I think you threaten and intimidate and bully because deep down, you are the weakest, most pathetic excuse for a man I have ever encountered. Charles shot to his feet so quickly that his chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor with a sound like breaking bones. How dare you speak to me like that? Do you know who my family is? Do you understand what we can do to people like you? People like me, Clay asked, and for the first time, something resembling a smile touched the corners of his mouth. You mean people who have actually fought for something that mattered? People who have put their lives on the line for something bigger than their own ego? People who know the difference between real strength and the pathetic power trips of spoiled children? He was close enough now that Charles had to look up to meet his gaze. Close enough that the difference in their physical presence was unmistakable. Clay had spent years in combat zones, had trained his body and mind to function under the kind of pressure that would break most people. Charles had spent his years in boardrooms and country clubs, soft and safe and utterly unprepared for this moment. Here's what's going to happen, Clay said quietly. You are going to apologize to my sister. You are going to leave this restaurant, and you are never going to touch her again. Charles's face had gone from red to purple, veins standing out on his forehead as rage and humiliation warred for control. You cannot tell me what to do. She is my wife, my property. I will do whatever I want with her, and there is nothing you or anyone else can do to stop me. The admission was captured by a dozen phones, recorded in high definition and uploaded to social media before Charles even realized what he had said. In his fury, he had stripped away all pretense and revealed exactly who he was for the world to see. Property, Clay repeated, and now his voice carried something that made several people near them push back from their tables. "Did you just call my pregnant sister your property?" That was when Charles made his final, fatal mistake. Perhaps it was the wine, or the adrenaline, or simply a lifetime of never facing consequences for his actions. But he reached out and pushed Clay's chest with both hands, trying to shove him away from the table. "Get away from us, you worthless piece of trash. Take your military hero complex and get out of my sight before I have you arrested for harassment." Clay did not move. Charles might as well have been pushing against a mountain for all the effect his shove had, but something in the restaurant's atmosphere changed. Like the moment before lightning strikes, when every hair on your body stands up and the air itself seems to hold its breath. Clay looked down at the hands pressed against his chest, then back up at Charles's face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room with perfect clarity. "Sir, you have just made the biggest mistake of your life." For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, the entire restaurant held its breath. 50 witnesses watched as Clay stared down at Charles's hands pressed against his chest, then slowly, deliberately, looked back up into the other man's face. The silence was so complete that the sound of Vivian's sharp intake of breath seemed to echo off the walls. Charles, perhaps finally realizing he had crossed a line he could not uncross, tried to step backward. But Clay's hand moved with liquid precision, closing around Charles's wrist and holding him in place with the kind of controlled strength that spoke of years of training and absolute confidence. "Remove your hands," Clay said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to giving orders in life or death situations. "Now!" The word hit Charles like a physical blow. Whatever bravado he had summoned by pushing Clay evaporated as he found himself unable to break free from the iron grip holding his wrist. For the first time in his privileged life, Charles Edward Whitmore III was physically overpowered by someone who would not be intimidated by his name or his family's influence. "Let go of me," Charles demanded, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear he was trying to hide. "This is assault. I will have you arrested." "You put your hands on me first," Clay replied matter-of-factly, still holding Charles's wrist with effortless strength. "In front of 50 witnesses with phones, after striking my pregnant sister in my restaurant, I would say my response has been remarkably restrained so far." Travis Burns emerged from the kitchen then, moving with the same purposeful efficiency as Clay. At 29, Travis had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before joining Clay in civilian life, first as a sous chef and now as his business partner. He took in the scene with a single glance and positioned himself strategically near the kitchen entrance, ready to control access and backup if needed. "Everything all right out here, chef?" Travis asked, using the tone that indicated he already knew everything, was decidedly not all right, and was prepared to act accordingly. "Just having a conversation with Mr. Whitmore about restaurant etiquette," Clay replied without taking his eyes off Charles. "He seems to be having some difficulty understanding the basic concepts of respect and appropriate behavior." Maureen Kelly, the restaurant manager, had been watching the confrontation unfold from her position near the hostess stand. At 45, she had seen every type of difficult customer imaginable, but nothing had prepared her for this level of open violence and intimidation. She had already called the police, her hands shaking as she provided details to the dispatcher. "Mr. Grace," she called out, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "The authorities are on their way." Charles's face went pale as the implications hit him. Police meant reports, reports meant records, and records meant his carefully maintained public image would be shattered beyond repair. His family's lawyers were good, but they could not undo video evidence of him striking a pregnant woman in front of dozens of witnesses. "This is ridiculous," he blustered, finally managing to pull his wrist free from Clay's grip. "I was defending myself against this maniac. He threatened me. He assaulted me." "Actually," said a clear voice from a nearby table, "I recorded the entire incident. Would you like me to play it back?" The speaker was an elderly woman dining alone, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her eyes sharp with intelligence. She held up her phone with the confidence of someone who had witnessed injustice and refused to let it stand unchallenged. "As did I," added another diner, a young man who looked like he might be a journalist or blogger. "Posted it live to my social media accounts. 60,000 followers so far, growing by the minute." The color drained entirely from Charles's face as he realized the scope of his exposure. In the age of viral videos and instant global communication, his moment of uncontrolled rage had just been broadcast to the world. There would be no covering this up, no using family connections to make it disappear. "You do not understand," he said desperately, looking around the room as if searching for allies who would never come. "She is my wife. This is a private family matter. You have no right to interfere." "I understand perfectly," Clay replied, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child. "You hit my pregnant sister in my restaurant. You threatened her, called her your property, and then put your hands on me when I intervened. There is nothing private about public assault, and there is nothing familial about abuse." He stepped closer, and Charles instinctively backed away, bumping into the overturned chair behind him. "Here is what you clearly do not understand. I spent 8 years in the Navy SEALs. I have been trained to neutralize threats with maximum efficiency and minimum collateral damage. Right now, in front of all these witnesses, you represent a clear and present danger to my sister and her unborn child." Clay's voice never rose above conversational level, but something in his tone made everyone in the restaurant understand they were witnessing a predator deciding whether to attack. "The only reason you are still conscious is because I choose to let you remain so. The only reason you are not currently on the floor with several broken bones is because I respect my sister too much to traumatize her further with unnecessary violence." Charles opened his mouth to speak, but Clay raised a single finger that stopped him as effectively as a shout. "But understand this very clearly," Clay continued. "My restraint has limits. If you ever, and I mean ever, lay a hand on my sister again, if you threaten her, intimidate her, or cause her one moment of fear or pain, I will forget about legal consequences and civilian rules of engagement. I will hunt you down and teach you exactly what 8 years of special operations training can accomplish when applied with personal motivation." The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that several diners actually pushed back from their tables, instinctively creating distance from the controlled violence radiating from Clay's still form. Charles tried to speak again, but found his mouth dry and his voice gone. "Do you understand me?" Clay asked. Charles nodded wordlessly, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Good. Now you are going to apologize to my sister, and then you are going to leave this restaurant. Security cameras and witnesses have recorded everything that happened here tonight. If I were you, I would contact a very good lawyer and prepare for the legal consequences of your actions." Vivian had been sitting frozen throughout the confrontation, her hands pressed protectively over her pregnant belly as she watched her brother transform into someone she barely recognized. She had known Clay was dangerous, had understood intellectually that his military training made him capable of violence most people could not imagine. But seeing him in action, watching him dominate a situation through sheer force of will and controlled intimidation, was both terrifying and deeply reassuring. "Charles," she said quietly, her voice stronger than it had been all evening, "I think you should leave." He turned to look at her, his face a mask of confusion and rage. "You are taking his side against your own husband." "I am taking the side of someone who has never hit me," Vivian replied, and the simple statement carried more weight than any accusation. "I am taking the side of someone who protects me instead of hurting me." The sound of sirens could be heard approaching in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Charles looked around the restaurant one final time, seeing only hostile faces and recording devices documenting his complete humiliation. "This is not over," he said, his voice shaking with impotent fury. "You have no idea what you have started here. No idea what I am capable of." Clay smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Actually, I have a very good idea what you are capable of. I have seen you in action tonight. You are capable of hitting a pregnant woman and running your mouth when you think you are safe. What I am curious about is whether you understand what I am capable of." Charles had no answer for that. As the police sirens grew louder and the reality of his situation began to sink in, he turned and walked quickly toward the restaurant's exit, leaving behind his wife, his reputation, and any pretense that he was anything other than a coward who preyed on those weaker than himself. But as he reached the door, he turned back one final time, his eyes finding Vivian across the crowded dining room. "This is not over," he repeated, and this time the threat was unmistakable. Not by a long shot. To Ranonum. Detective Vernon Walsh arrived at Coastal Kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been working domestic violence cases for the better part of 2 decades. At 52, he carried himself with the bearing of a veteran who had seen humanity at its worst and still chose to fight for its best. His gray hair was cropped short. His brown eyes held the kind of tired wisdom that came from too many nights like this one, and his presence immediately commanded respect from everyone in the restaurant. Walsh had been a Marine before joining the police force, which meant he understood exactly what he was looking at when he saw Clay standing protectively near his sister's table. Military bearing was unmistakable, especially in a crisis situation, and the detective could read the controlled violence in Clay's posture like a roadmap. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walsh announced to the restaurant, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to taking control of chaotic situations. "I am Detective Walsh with the County Sheriff's Department. I understand there was an incident here tonight involving domestic violence. I am going to need everyone to remain calm while I gather information." Maureen approached him immediately, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the evening's events. "Detective, I am the manager here. I called 911 after witnessing Mr. Whitmore strike his pregnant wife. The entire incident was captured on our security cameras, and several customers recorded it on their phones." "Thank you, ma'am. I will need copies of all available footage." Walsh's eyes moved to Vivian, who was still seated at the table, one hand pressed to her reddened cheek and the other protectively covering her pregnant belly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I presume I am going to need to speak with you about what happened here tonight." Vivian looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of fear, shame, and something that might have been hope. "It was not that bad," she said automatically, the words coming out before she could stop them. "I mean, he was upset about something, and I probably should not have talked back, and maybe I misunderstood, ma'am." Walsh interrupted gently, his voice carrying the patience of someone who had heard these exact words countless times before. "You have a handprint on your face, and 50 people witnessed your husband strike you. There is no misunderstanding to be had here." Clay stepped forward, his protective instincts triggered by his sister's attempt to minimize what had happened. "Detective, my name is Clayton Grace. This is my restaurant, and Vivian is my sister. What we witnessed tonight was not a misunderstanding or a domestic dispute. It was clear-cut assault by a man with a documented history of intimidation and control." Walsh turned his attention to Clay, taking in the military bearing, the controlled anger, and the obvious expertise in handling dangerous situations. "Mr. Grace, I appreciate your concern for your sister, but I need to hear her account of events directly. However, I would like to speak with you separately about what you observed and how you responded." That was when Dorothy Grace arrived, bursting through the restaurant's front door with the focused determination of a mother whose child was in danger. At 58, Dorothy retained the brisk efficiency of her nursing career and the fierce protectiveness that came from raising 2 children, largely on her own after her husband's early death. "Where is she?" Dorothy demanded, her eyes scanning the restaurant until she found Vivian still seated at the table. "Oh, honey, what did he do to you?" The appearance of her mother seemed to break something loose in Vivian's carefully maintained composure. For the first time since the slap, tears began to flow freely as she stood and moved into Dorothy's embrace, her pregnant form awkward but desperate for the comfort and safety her mother represented. "I am sorry," Vivian whispered against her mother's shoulder. "I am so sorry for all of this. I should have been more careful. Should not have said anything. Should not have made him angry." "Stop!" Dorothy said firmly, pulling back to look into her daughter's eyes. "This is not your fault. Do you hear me? Nothing you said or did justifies what happened here tonight." Walsh watched the family reunion with the clinical eye of someone trained to observe human behavior under stress. He had seen this pattern many times before: the victim's initial attempt to minimize the abuse, the family's protective response, and the complex dynamics that made domestic violence cases so challenging to prosecute successfully. "Mrs. Grace," he said, addressing Dorothy, "I assume someone called you about the incident." "Maureen called me," Dorothy replied, never taking her eyes off her daughter's face. "I am a retired nurse. Detective. I know what stress and trauma can do to a pregnant woman. We need to get her to a hospital for evaluation." As if summoned by her words, Vivian suddenly gasped and doubled over, her hands clutching her abdomen as a sharp pain shot through her midsection. The baby, which had been moving restlessly all evening, suddenly went completely still. "Something's wrong," Vivian said, her voice tight with pain and fear. "The baby. Something's wrong with the baby." Clay was at her side instantly, his arm supporting her weight as she struggled to remain upright. "We need to get her to the hospital now," he said, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood that every second could matter. "I am calling an ambulance," Walsh said, already reaching for his radio, but Dorothy shook her head. "My car is right outside, and the hospital is only 5 minutes away. An ambulance will take longer to get here than it will take us to get there." She looked at Clay with the expression of someone making a battlefield decision. "Can you carry her?" "Of course." Clay was already moving, scooping Vivian into his arms with the easy strength of someone who had carried wounded comrades to safety. "Travis, take care of things here. Maureen, send copies of everything to Detective Walsh." As they headed toward the door, Walsh called after them. "Mrs. Whitmore, we still need to discuss what happened here tonight. This investigation is not going away just because you are having a medical emergency." Vivian looked back at him over Clay's shoulder, her face pale and drawn with pain. "I understand, Detective, but right now, I need to make sure my baby is all right." They were almost to the exit when Charles reappeared, flanked by a woman in an expensive suit who could only be his lawyer. Eleanor Blake Whitmore shared her brother's aristocratic features, but carried herself with the sharp competence of someone who cleaned up other people's messes for a living. "Where do you think you're going with my client's wife?" Eleanor demanded, stepping into their path with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way through legal intimidation. Clay did not slow down or acknowledge her presence in any way. He simply adjusted his grip on Vivian and continued moving toward the door with the implacable momentum of a force of nature. "Get out of my way," he said quietly. And something in his tone made Eleanor instinctively step aside despite her legal training and professional bravado. Charles, emboldened by his sister's presence and the protection of legal representation, tried one final power play. "Vivian, you will come home with me right now. We can handle this medical situation privately, with our own doctor, without involving the authorities or making this circus any worse than you already have." Vivian lifted her head from Clay's shoulder and looked directly at her husband for the first time since he had struck her. When she spoke, her voice was weak from pain, but absolutely clear in its resolve. "I am not going anywhere with you, Charles. I am going to the hospital to make sure our baby is safe, and then I am going to decide what happens next. But I will never, ever, put myself or this child in a position where you can hurt us again." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. For the first time since the incident began, he seemed to understand that his actions might have consequences beyond legal troubles and public embarrassment. He might actually lose control of his wife, his child, and the carefully constructed life that depended on his ability to dominate and intimidate. "You cannot leave me," he said, and for the first time all evening, he sounded genuinely desperate rather than angry. "Vivian, we can work this out. I was under stress, I had too much to whine. I lost my temper. It will not happen again." But Clay was already pushing through the restaurant's doors, carrying his sister toward Dorothy's car, and away from the man who had spent 3 years systematically destroying her sense of self-worth and safety. As they reached the parking lot, Vivian was hit by another wave of pain, this one strong enough to make her cry out. The baby, which had been moving constantly throughout her pregnancy, remained ominously still. "Drive fast. Mom," Clay said as he gently placed Vivian in the back seat and climbed in beside her. "I think we might be running out of time." Behind them, Charles stood in the restaurant's doorway, watching the car disappear into the night and realizing that his world as he knew it was ending. Tomorrow, the videos would be everywhere. His family would demand explanations he could not provide. His business associates would distance themselves from the scandal. And somewhere in the chaos of consequences and recriminations, he had lost the only real power he had ever possessed, his wife's fear. Detective Walsh remained in the restaurant, methodically collecting evidence and witness statements, building a case that would ensure Charles Edward Whitmore III faced justice for his actions. But as he worked, he could not shake the feeling that tonight's incident was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. In his experience, men like Charles did not simply accept defeat and move on. They escalated. They retaliated. They found new ways to hurt the people who had dared to stand up to them. And somewhere in the night, A decorated Navy SEAL was preparing to protect his family by any means necessary. The emergency room at Coastal Regional Medical Center buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Saturday night. But Dr. Sarah Chen took one look at Vivian's pale face and elevated stress levels and immediately moved her to the front of the triage line. At 34, Dr. Chen had delivered hundreds of babies and handled countless pregnancy emergencies. But something about this case triggered all her protective instincts. Mrs. Whitmore, I am Dr. Chen. I understand you experienced some trauma this evening, and you are concerned about your baby. She spoke with the calm efficiency of someone trained to project confidence, even in crisis situations. Vivian nodded, wincing as another wave of cramping pains shot through her abdomen. The baby was moving constantly during the incident, but now I cannot feel anything, and these pains started right after. She could not bring herself to say the words, "After my husband hit me," in front of a stranger. After the domestic violence incident, Dr. Chen finished matter-of-factly, making notes on her tablet. Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to understand that stress-induced pregnancy complications are very real and very serious. What happened to you tonight was not only criminal, it was potentially life-threatening to both you and your child. Clay stood against the wall of the examination room, his arms crossed and his expression grim. He had been silent during the intake process, but Dr. Chen could see the controlled fury radiating from his still form. She had treated enough military families to recognize the signs of someone trained for violence working very hard to maintain control. Mr. Grace, I assume, she said, turning to address him directly. The patient's brother. Yes, ma'am. Clay Grace. I own the restaurant where the incident occurred. His voice was steady, but Dr. Chen could hear the underlying tension. Doctor, is the baby going to be all right? We are going to do everything we can to find out. First, I need to get Mrs. Whitmore connected to a fetal monitor so we can assess the baby's heart rate and movement patterns. Then we will do an ultrasound to check for any signs of placental abruption or other trauma-related complications. Dorothy had been holding Vivian's hand throughout the examination, her nursing training helping her interpret the medical terminology and procedures. Doctor, my daughter's blood pressure has been elevated throughout this pregnancy. Her obstetrician has been monitoring it, but given the stress of tonight's events, I am concerned about preeclampsia or early labor. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. You are absolutely right to be concerned. Domestic violence is one of the leading causes of pregnancy complications, and the stress hormones released during traumatic events can trigger a cascade of problems for both mother and baby. As if to emphasize her point, Vivian suddenly gripped the examination table's rail and doubled over as another contraction hit. This one was stronger than the others, lasting nearly a minute and leaving her breathing heavily when it finally subsided. That felt like real labor, Vivian whispered, fear evident in her voice. But I am only 7 months along. It is too early. Mrs. Whitmore, we are going to admit you for observation and treatment. I want to get you on medication to stop these contractions and monitor you and the baby closely for the next 24 to 48 hours. Dr. Chen's tone was reassuring but serious. The good news is that even if we cannot stop the labor completely, babies born at 32 weeks have excellent survival rates with proper medical care. The word survival hit the room like a physical blow. For the first time since the incident began, Vivian fully understood the potential consequences of Charles's actions. This was not just about bruises or hurt feelings or damaged relationships. Her husband's violence had put their unborn child's life at risk. I need to call Charles, she said automatically, reaching for her phone. He should be here. He needs to know what is happening with the baby. Clay stepped forward immediately, his hand gently covering hers to stop her from making the call. Viv, you do not need to do that right now. You need to focus on getting yourself and the baby stable. But he is the father, Vivian protested, though her voice lacked conviction. He has a right to know. He lost his rights when he put you and the baby in danger, Clay replied firmly. Right now, the only thing that matters is your health and safety. Dr. Chen looked between the siblings, reading the family dynamics with the expertise of someone who had navigated countless similar situations. Mrs. Whitmore, legally speaking, your husband does have certain rights regarding medical decisions and information about his child. However, given the documented domestic violence incident, we can implement safety protocols that prioritize your well-being. That was when Eleanor Blake Whitmore appeared in the doorway. Having somehow talked her way past hospital security, she wore the expression of someone accustomed to gaining access to restricted areas through sheer force of legal intimidation. Mrs. Whitmore, I am Eleanor Blake Whitmore, your husband's attorney and sister. I need to speak with you about the events of this evening and coordinate your medical care with your family's preferred physicians. Clay moved to block Eleanor's entry into the room, his body language making it clear that she was not welcome. She is not going anywhere or speaking to anyone until the doctors clear her, and she definitely does not need Charles's lawyer pressuring her while she is having pregnancy complications. I am not pressuring anyone, Eleanor replied smoothly. I am simply ensuring that my client's wife receives the best possible medical care and that his rights as the father are protected during this difficult time. Dr. Chen stepped between them with the authority of someone whose primary concern was patient welfare rather than legal maneuvering. Ms. Blake Whitmore, I am going to have to ask you to leave. My patient is experiencing a medical emergency that requires immediate attention in a stress-free environment. Any legal discussions can wait until she is stable. This is a private family matter, Eleanor insisted, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. The incident at the restaurant was a misunderstanding that has been blown out of proportion by social media and overzealous family members. The incident at the restaurant, Clay said with dangerous quiet, was captured on multiple cameras and witnessed by 50 people. There was no misunderstanding about a grown man hitting his pregnant wife hard enough to send her glasses flying. Dorothy looked up from where she had been monitoring Vivian's contractions. Eleanor, I remember you from the wedding. You seemed like a reasonable person then. Look at my daughter. Really look at her. She is having premature labor because your brother's violence triggered a medical emergency. Is protecting his reputation really more important than the life of his child? The question hung in the air as Eleanor's eyes moved to Vivian, taking in the pale complexion, the trembling hands, the protective posture of someone expecting another blow. For a moment, something like recognition flickered across her features. Charles is under a great deal of stress, Eleanor said finally, but the words sounded hollow even to her. His business, the economy, the pressure of becoming a father. Sometimes good men make bad choices when they are overwhelmed. Good men do not hit pregnant women, Clay replied with absolute finality. Ever. Under any circumstances, and lawyers who enable that behavior are not helping anyone, including their clients. Before Eleanor could respond, Vivian was hit by another contraction, this one strong enough to make her cry out despite her efforts to remain quiet. The fetal monitor, which had been showing irregular but present heartbeats, suddenly began beeping rapidly as the baby's distress signals escalated. Everyone out except family, Dr. Chen ordered, her tone brooking no argument. We need to get Mrs. Whitmore to labor and delivery immediately. As nurses appeared to transfer Vivian to a wheelchair and rush her to the maternity ward, Eleanor found herself being escorted from the room by hospital security. But as she reached the doorway, she turned back one final time. This will not end here, she said, looking directly at Clay. My family has resources you cannot imagine. If you think you can destroy my brother's life over one moment of poor judgment, you are seriously mistaken. Clay met her gaze with the steady calm of someone who had faced much more dangerous threats than corporate lawyers wielding legal briefs. Your brother destroyed his own life the moment he chose to hit my sister. I am just making sure there are consequences. As Vivian was wheeled away toward the maternity ward, Clay and Dorothy following close behind, Eleanor stood alone in the hallway and realized that for the first time in her legal career, she might be defending someone who was genuinely indefensible. Meanwhile, somewhere across town, Charles Edward Whitmore III sat in his empty mansion, scrolling through social media and watching his carefully constructed public image disintegrate in real time. The videos from the restaurant had gone viral, shared thousands of times with commentary that ranged from outrage to disgusted to simply disbelieving that anyone could be so cruel to a pregnant woman. But Charles was not thinking about his reputation or his legal troubles or even his business prospects. He was thinking about control and how a decorated Navy SEAL had just taken away the most important thing he had ever possessed, his wife's fear. That was a problem that required a solution. And Charles had never been someone who accepted defeat gracefully. The maternity ward at Coastal Regional Medical Center, operated under a different set of rules than the rest of the hospital. Here, security was tighter, access was restricted, and the staff was trained to handle everything from joyful celebrations to devastating losses. Dr. Chen had admitted Vivian to a private room where monitors tracked both her vital signs and the baby's, painting a picture of two lives hanging in delicate balance. The contractions have slowed down with the medication, Dr. Chen explained to the family gathered around Vivian's bedside. But I want to keep her here for at least 48 hours to make sure we have stabilized the situation. The baby's heart rate is returning to normal ranges, which is encouraging. Vivian lay propped up in the hospital bed, looking fragile and exhausted but more alert than she had been in the emergency room. The IV in her arm delivered a steady stream of medications designed to stop premature labor, while the fetal monitor beside her bed provided a constant reminder of the tiny life she was fighting to protect. "I feel like such an idiot," she said quietly, her voice thick with shame and exhaustion. 3 years. I put up with his control and his criticism and his threats for 3 years, and I told myself it was normal. That marriage was supposed to be hard work. Dorothy reached over and smoothed her daughter's hair with the gentle touch of a mother who had held her through countless childhood fears and tears. "Honey, you are not an idiot. You are a victim of someone who systematically manipulated and controlled you. What Charles did to you was not your fault." Clay stood at the window overlooking the hospital parking lot, his posture that of a sentry maintaining watch. He had been quiet since they arrived at the maternity ward, but Vivian could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Clay," she said softly, and he turned immediately, giving her his full attention. "I need to tell you something. Tonight was not the first time." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding and fury that reached every corner. Clay's face went completely still, the kind of stillness that preceded either violence or perfect control. "How long?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "It started about 6 months after we got married. Little things at first. Grabbing my arm too hard when he was angry. Pushing me against walls during arguments. He said it was my fault for making him lose his temper." Vivian's words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for so long that they could no longer be contained. "Then it got worse. He would slap me when I talked back or questioned his decisions. He said I was being disrespectful, that I needed to learn my place as his wife, and I believed him, because he was so careful to make it seem reasonable, like it was just normal married life." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears as she listened to her daughter describe years of abuse that had been carefully hidden from everyone who loved her. "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you ask for help?" "Because he convinced me it was my fault," Vivian replied, her voice breaking. "He made me believe that if I were a better wife, more obedient, more grateful, he would not need to correct my behavior. And when I got pregnant, I thought maybe things would change. Maybe becoming a father would make him gentler." Clay turned back to the window, his reflection showing a face that could have been carved from stone. Instead, it made him worse. "Yes, he said the baby was proof that I belonged to him completely now. That I could never leave because no one else would want a woman with another man's child. He started hitting me more often and harder because he said pregnancy made women emotional and I needed firmer guidance." The clinical way she described years of systematic abuse was somehow more heartbreaking than tears would have been. Clay recognized the pattern from his military service. Victims of prolonged trauma often developed a detached, analytical way of discussing their experiences as a survival mechanism. "The night before our anniversary dinner, he hit me because I suggested we needed to start shopping for baby furniture. He said I was being presumptuous, spending his money without permission. When I tried to protect my stomach, he grabbed my wrist and twisted it until I cried. Then he made me apologize for making him angry." Clay's reflection in the window showed his hands slowly clenching into fists. 8 years of military training had taught him to compartmentalize his emotions during crisis situations. But listening to his sister describe years of abuse was testing the limits of his professional composure. "I should have seen it," Dorothy said, her voice thick with guilt. "I am a nurse. I know the signs of domestic violence. How did I miss it for 3 years?" "Because he was careful," Vivian replied. "He never left marks where they would show. He never hit me before family gatherings or important events. He made sure I looked happy and successful whenever anyone might be watching. That was when Detective Walsh appeared in the doorway, his expression grim but determined. Mrs. Whitmore, I am sorry to disturb you during your medical treatment, but I have some updates on the investigation that you need to hear. Clay stepped forward protectively, but Vivian nodded for the detective to continue. What kind of updates? First, the good news. We have overwhelming evidence of the assault, multiple video recordings, dozens of witnesses, and physical evidence including the handprint on your face. The district attorney's office has already approved charges of domestic violence, assault, and public endangerment. And the bad news, Clay asked, reading something in the detective's tone that suggested complications. Your husband's family has retained Morrison, Sterling, and Associates. They are the most expensive criminal defense firm on the West Coast, and they specialize in making problems disappear for wealthy clients. They have already filed motions claiming the incident was mutual combat, that you provoked the altercation, and that the videos do not tell the complete story. Vivian felt the familiar fear rising in her chest. The voice Charles had planted there, telling her that his family's power and influence would make this all her fault somehow. Can they do that? Can they make this go away? Not easily, Walsh replied, but they can make it expensive, time-consuming, and traumatic for you. They will attack your character, your motives, your credibility. They will claim you are an unstable, vindictive wife trying to destroy your husband's reputation for financial gain. Clay turned from the window, his expression cold and focused. Detective, what are our options for protecting my sister from legal harassment while she is recovering from pregnancy complications? Restraining order is already in place, which means Charles cannot contact her or come within 500 feet of her, the hospital, her workplace, or any family member's home. But his lawyers can still conduct their investigation and file their motions. There is something else, Walsh continued, consulting his notes. Mr. Whitmore has been making some concerning statements since leaving the restaurant. According to witnesses, he has been talking about how this incident will ruin his life and his family's reputation. He has mentioned that some people deserve whatever happens to them when they destroy innocent men. The implicit threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Clay understood the language of violence and retaliation, and Charles's words had all the hallmarks of someone planning to escalate rather than accept consequences. What kind of protection can you provide? Clay asked. Patrol units will increase their presence around the hospital, your restaurant, and your family's homes. But realistically, if someone with Charles's resources wants to cause problems, it can be difficult to prevent. That was when Eleanor Blake Whitmore reappeared, this time accompanied by hospital administration and what appeared to be additional legal counsel. She moved with the confidence of someone who had used institutional pressure to gain access where she was not wanted. Mrs. Whitmore, she announced, I represent your husband's interests in this matter. I need to inform you that any statements you make to law enforcement without proper legal representation present could prejudice his case and potentially expose you to charges of filing false reports. Clay stepped between Eleanor and his sister's hospital bed, his movement fluid and decisive. She has already told you to leave. Hospital security has already escorted you out once. If you continue to harass my sister while she is receiving medical treatment, I will personally ensure that you join your brother in facing criminal charges. Mr. Grace, I understand you are upset, but threatening an officer of the court is not advisable. Eleanor's voice carried the practiced calm of someone accustomed to verbal combat. Your sister's emotional state may be affecting her perception of events. Memory can be unreliable during traumatic situations. Are you suggesting that 50 witnesses and multiple video recordings are also suffering from unreliable memory? Detective Walsh asked, stepping forward with the authority of law enforcement. Because I have never seen a clearer case of domestic violence in my 20-year career. Eleanor's composure slipped slightly as she realized that the usual tactics of intimidation and doubt casting were not working with this particular group of people. Detective, I am sure you understand that domestic disputes are often more complex than they initially appear. My client is a respected businessman with no prior record of violence. Sometimes good people make poor choices under stress. Sometimes, Clay said with dangerous quiet, wealthy people think their money protects them from consequences. Sometimes they discover they are wrong. The standoff was interrupted by Dr. Chen, who entered the room with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to cutting through nonsense to protect her patients. I am going to need everyone except immediate family to leave this room immediately. My patient is experiencing stress-induced complications that are threatening both her life and her child's life. Any further disruption to her treatment will result in security removing all visitors. As Eleanor was once again escorted from the room, she called back over her shoulder, "Mrs. Whitmore, you should know that your husband is genuinely concerned about your well-being and the baby's health. He wants to work together to resolve this misunderstanding privately, within the family." Vivian looked up from her hospital bed, her face pale but her voice steady. "Tell my husband that there is no misunderstanding to resolve. Tell him that the next time he sees me will be in court, and the next time he sees his child will be supervised by court-appointed officials. And tell him that if he ever comes near me again, my brother will show him exactly what 8 years of Navy SEAL training looks like when applied with personal motivation." The words, delivered with quiet dignity from a hospital bed where she was fighting to save her unborn child, carried more power than any legal threat or official warning. Eleanor left the room in silence, finally understanding that she was not just defending her brother against criminal charges. She was fighting a war she had already lost. In the parking lot below, Charles Edward Whitmore III sat in his Mercedes, watching the windows of the maternity ward and planning his next move. He had never been someone who accepted defeat gracefully, and he was not about to start now. His wife thought she could humiliate him publicly and face no consequences. Her brother thought military training made him untouchable. They were about to learn how dangerous it could be to underestimate the vindictive creativity of a wealthy man with nothing left to lose. Clay left the hospital at dawn, after ensuring that both Vivian and the baby were stable and that Dorothy would maintain constant vigil. He drove through the empty streets with the focused purpose of someone transitioning from protective mode to offensive operations. 3 years of abuse demanded more than just criminal charges and restraining orders. It demanded intelligence gathering and strategic planning. Travis Burns was waiting at Coastal Kitchen when Clay arrived, along with 2 other men who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of military veterans. Jack Martinez had served 3 tours in Iraq as a Marine reconnaissance specialist, while Danny O'Connor had been Clay's team leader during their final deployment in Afghanistan. Both men had dropped everything to respond when Travis called them about the situation. "How's Vivian?" Travis asked immediately, his concern evident. "Stable for now. The doctors think they can prevent premature labor if she stays on bed rest and avoids stress." Clay's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been running on adrenaline for 12 hours. "But Charles is not going away quietly. His family has hired the most expensive legal team on the West Coast, and they are already working to discredit her testimony." Jack Martinez looked up from the laptop where he had been scrolling through social media coverage of the incident. "The videos have been shared over 2 million times. Most of the comments are supportive of Vivian, but Charles's people are already working to control the narrative. They are claiming she provoked the incident and that you used excessive force in responding." "What kind of man hits a pregnant woman?" Danny asked, his Irish accent thickening with disgust. "In my neighborhood growing up, that would have earned him a beating that put him in the hospital for months." Clay poured himself coffee from the machine behind the restaurant's bar, his movements automatic and precise. "Charles Edward Whitmore III is the kind of man who has never faced real consequences for his actions. Old money family, Ivy League education, connections that have protected him from accountability his entire life." "Not anymore," Travis said grimly. "Elite Security Solutions called me this morning. They handle security for 3 restaurants in the same group as us, and they wanted to warn us that someone has been asking questions about your background and the restaurant's finances." Clay's attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of questions? Financial records, employee backgrounds, health department inspections, liquor licensing, immigration status of kitchen staff? The kind of comprehensive investigation that suggests someone is looking for pressure points to exploit." Jack closed his laptop and turned to face Clay directly. "Brother, I think you need to understand what you are dealing with here. I did some research on the Whitmore family last night. They are not just wealthy. They are connected at levels that most people cannot even imagine." He pulled out a folder filled with printouts and documents. Charles's grandfather was a federal judge. His father sits on the boards of 3 major corporations and 2 federal banking committees. His uncle is a retired senator who still has influence in Washington. His sister Eleanor is not just a corporate lawyer. She specializes in crisis management for wealthy families facing public scandals. They have made problems disappear before, Danny added, consulting his own notes. In 1995, Charles's cousin was arrested for sexually assaulting a college student. The charges were dropped after the victim received a settlement that included a non-disclosure agreement. In 2003, Charles's brother was involved in a hit-and-run accident that killed a pedestrian. The family's investigators found evidence that the victim was intoxicated, and the brother received 2 years of probation. Clay absorbed the information with the methodical attention of someone trained to assess enemy capabilities and resources. So they have experience in discrediting victims and manipulating the legal system. More than that, Jack continued, they have a pattern of escalating retaliation against anyone who threatens their family's reputation. In 2007, a business partner tried to expose some questionable financial practices at one of their companies. He ended up facing federal tax evasion charges, lost his business, and had to declare bankruptcy. The charges were eventually dropped, Danny noted, but not until after his life was completely destroyed. Travis leaned forward across the table where they had spread their research materials. Clay, these people play a different game than anything we faced overseas. They do not use guns or bombs. They use lawyers and private investigators and institutional pressure to crush anyone who gets in their way. So what are you suggesting? Clay asked, though his tone indicated he already knew the answer. We fight back using their own methods, Jack replied. Intelligence gathering, pressure points, leverage. We find out what skeletons the Whitmore family has been hiding, and we make sure they understand that protecting Charles means exposing themselves to the same kind of scrutiny they are planning to use against Vivian. Clay considered the proposal, weighing his protective instincts against his understanding of legal and ethical boundaries. We do this right. No illegal surveillance, no breaking and entering, no methods that could compromise the criminal case against Charles. Agreed, Danny said. But there are plenty of public records, social media histories, business connections, and personal relationships that can tell us what we need to know. If the Whitmore family wants to play hardball, they need to understand that they are not the only ones with resources and expertise. That was when Clay's phone rang. The caller ID showed Eleanor Blake Whitmore's office number, which meant Charles's legal team was already making their next move. Mr. Grace, this is Eleanor Blake Whitmore. I think we need to have a conversation about resolving this situation in a way that protects everyone's interests, including your sister's long-term well-being. Clay put the phone on speaker so the others could hear. Mrs. Blake Whitmore, my sister's long-term well-being would be best served by your brother facing full legal consequences for his actions and staying away from her permanently. Mr. Grace, I understand you are angry, but you need to consider the practical realities of this situation. My brother is willing to accept responsibility for his poor judgment last night, seek counseling for anger management, and provide generous financial support for your sister and the baby. In exchange, we would ask that she not pursue criminal charges that could destroy his career and reputation. The offer was delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who had made similar deals many times before. Clay could almost hear the unspoken threats lurking beneath the reasonable tone. And if she refuses your generous offer, Clay asked, then we will be forced to defend my brother vigorously, which means exposing every aspect of your sister's life to public scrutiny. Her financial difficulties before marriage, her history of depression and anxiety, her dependence on my brother's income and social status. We will argue that she orchestrated this incident to gain leverage in a potential divorce settlement. Jack, Danny, and Travis exchanged looks that communicated years of shared combat experience and mutual understanding. They had heard this kind of threat before, from different enemies in different contexts, but the underlying message was always the same: surrender or face total destruction. Ms. Blake Whitmore, Clay said with the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child, let me make sure I understand your position. You are threatening to destroy my pregnant sister's reputation and mental health if she does not allow your brother to escape consequences for committing domestic violence in front of 50 witnesses. I am explaining the legal realities of a complex situation, Eleanor replied, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Criminal trials are public proceedings. Evidence will be presented, testimony will be given, and details of their marriage will become part of the public record. Then I guess we will see each other in court, Clay replied. And Ms. Blake Whitmore, you might want to spend some time researching my background before you decide how far you want to escalate this situation. I am not some frightened civilian who can be intimidated by legal threats and character assassination. He ended the call and looked around the table at his assembled team. Gentlemen, I believe we have just declared war on one of the most powerful families on the West Coast. Anyone who wants to walk away now has my complete understanding and no hard feelings. Jack Martinez smiled with the expression of someone who had been waiting his entire civilian life for a mission worthy of his skills. Brother, we did not survive Fallujah and Kandahar just to let some rich boy terrorize your family. When do we start? Danny O'Connor was already opening his laptop. I still have contacts in federal law enforcement and private security. Give me 48 hours, and I will have a complete background file on every member of the Whitmore family going back 3 generations. Travis stood up and moved to the restaurant's front windows, scanning the street for any signs of surveillance or unusual activity. Meanwhile, we need to assume they are already watching us. Private investigators, electronic surveillance, financial monitoring. From now on, we operate under the assumption that everything we do and say is being recorded and analyzed. Clay felt a familiar sensation settling over him, the calm focus that had kept him alive through 8 years of special operations missions. Then we give them something worth recording. Jack, I want you to start with Charles's business dealings. Any SEC violations, tax irregularities, questionable partnerships. Danny, focus on the family's legal history, every lawsuit, every settlement, every time they use their influence to make problems disappear. What about Eleanor? Travis asked. She is the immediate threat in terms of legal strategy. Eleanor is interesting, Clay replied thoughtfully. She seemed genuinely uncomfortable when she saw Vivian's condition at the hospital. My guess is she has been cleaning up Charles's messes for years, but this might be the first time she has had to look directly at one of his victims. He turned back to the group, his expression grim but determined. The Whitmore family has spent decades believing their money and connections make them untouchable. They have systematically destroyed anyone who threatened their interests, and they expect us to fold like all the others? Clay's phone buzzed with a text message from Dorothy. Vivian is asking for you. Doctor says baby is stable, but wants to keep her another day. Charles's lawyers tried to visit, but hospital security turned them away. They are about to learn, Clay continued, that some people fight back, and when you target a veteran's family, you better be prepared for the kind of war you have never experienced before. As the group dispersed to begin their intelligence gathering operation, none of them noticed the plain sedan parked across the street from the restaurant, its tinted windows concealing the private investigator who had been documenting their meeting for the past hour. The war between the Grace family and the Whitmore empire had officially begun. Dr. Chen released Vivian from the hospital with strict instructions for bed rest and a follow-up appointment in 48 hours. But Clay knew that returning to her shared apartment with Charles was out of the question. Instead, he drove her to a safe house that Danny O'Connor had arranged through his contacts in federal law enforcement, a modest 2-bedroom cottage 20 miles inland, far from Charles's usual haunts and protected by security systems that would make a professional proud. This feels like I am running away, Vivian said as Clay helped her from the car, her movements still careful and deliberate. The medication had stopped the contractions, but Dr. Chen had warned that stress could trigger them again at any time. This feels like you are staying alive, Dorothy replied from the back seat, where she had been monitoring her daughter's condition during the drive. Honey, that man threatened you in front of witnesses. His lawyers have made it clear they intend to destroy your reputation and credibility. Until the criminal case is resolved, you need to be somewhere he cannot find you. The cottage sat on 5 acres of wooded land, its isolation providing natural security while remaining close enough to medical facilities if complications arose. Travis had stocked the kitchen with everything they would need for an extended stay, while Jack Martinez had installed additional security cameras and motion sensors around the perimeter. It is not forever, Clay assured her as he carried her suitcase into the master bedroom. Just until we know how Charles plans to respond to the charges, and until we have enough leverage to ensure he leaves you alone permanently. Vivian sank into the comfortable armchair by the bedroom window, her hands instinctively moving to her pregnant belly. The baby had been active since leaving the hospital, as if responding to the reduced stress levels and safer environment. Clay, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Her voice carried the serious tone of someone preparing for difficult truths. What exactly are you and your friends planning to do about Charles and his family? Clay sat on the edge of the bed, his expression carefully neutral. We are gathering information that might be useful for your legal case. Background research, financial records, anything that might help Detective Walsh and the prosecutor build a stronger case. That is not what I am asking, and you know it. Vivian's eyes held the kind of clarity that came from finally seeing a situation without the filter of fear and manipulation. I know you, Clay. I know what you are capable of when someone threatens your family. I need to know that you are not planning to do something that will land you in prison. The question hung in the air between them, carrying 3 decades of shared history and unconditional love. Clay had always been her protector, but she had also been his anchor to civilian life and moral certainty. Now she was asking him to choose between his protective instincts and his respect for her wishes. Charles escalated this situation when he put his hands on you, Clay said finally. He escalated it further when his family decided to wage legal warfare against a pregnant woman recovering from domestic violence. I will not let them destroy you to protect his reputation. But will you stay within the law? Vivian pressed. Will you promise me that whatever you do, you will not cross lines that you cannot uncross? Before Clay could answer, his phone rang with a call from Travis at the restaurant. Clay, we have a problem. Charles just showed up here with a court order demanding access to our security footage from last night. He is claiming his lawyers need it for his defense. But something feels wrong about this. Clay put the phone on speaker so Vivian and Dorothy could hear. What kind of court order? It looks legitimate, but it is signed by Judge Harrison Whitmore. Same last name as Charles. I am thinking this might be the family connection Jack warned us about. The implications hit Clay immediately. If the Whitmore family controlled the judge assigned to review evidence in Charles's case, they could manipulate the legal process in ways that went far beyond normal courtroom tactics. Travis, do not turn over anything until we have our own lawyer review that order. Take pictures of the document and send them to me immediately. Already done. But Clay, there is something else. While Charles was here making demands about the security footage, someone broke into the cottage where you had been staying before. Nothing was taken, but the place was searched thoroughly. Professional job. Barely any signs of forced entry. Vivian's face went pale as the reality of their situation became clear. They found where you live. They found where I used to live, Clay corrected, but his voice carried the grim understanding of someone who recognized escalating tactics. Good thing we moved you here instead of there. Dorothy stood up abruptly, her maternal instincts triggered by the growing threat to her daughter's safety. This is getting out of hand. Maybe we should consider Eleanor's offer to settle this privately, if it means protecting Vivian and the baby from this kind of harassment. Mom, no. Vivian's voice carried surprising strength for someone who had been hospitalized less than 24 hours earlier. If we give in to their threats now, Charles will know he can control me forever. Our child will grow up watching their father get away with violence because his family has money and influence. She struggled to her feet, one hand supporting her pregnant belly while the other gripped the chair arm for balance. I spent 3 years being afraid of him. I let him convince me that his anger was my fault, that his violence was my failure as a wife. I will not teach our child that bullies win when they have enough money and lawyers. Clay felt a surge of pride mixed with protective fury as he watched his sister find the courage that 3 years of systematic abuse had tried to destroy. Viv, that is exactly the kind of strength this situation requires. But we need to be smart about how we fight back. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Grace, this is Eleanor Blake Whitmore. I think we need to meet in person to discuss a resolution that protects everyone's interests. Neutral location, just the two of us. The situation is becoming more complicated than my brother initially understood. Clay showed the message to Vivian, who read it with the analytical attention of someone learning to recognize manipulation in genuine communication. She sounds different, less threatening, more concerned. Could be a trap, Dorothy warned, or it could be that she is starting to understand what kind of person her brother really is. Clay considered the options, weighing the potential for gathering intelligence against the risk of walking into an ambush or legal entrapment. There is only one way to find out, but I am not going alone, and I am not going anywhere they choose. He typed a response. Ms. Blake Whitmore, I am willing to meet, but the location will be public, neutral, and of my choosing. Coastal Community Center, main conference room, tomorrow at 2 p.m. You come alone. I will do the same. Any attempt at recording, surveillance, or legal entrapment ends the conversation immediately. The response came back within minutes. Agreed, Mr. Grace. I think you should know that this situation has revealed some things about my brother that I was not previously aware of. We need to discuss how to protect your sister without destroying two families in the process. Sakudi, Clay studied the message, his military training automatically analyzing the word choices and implications. Eleanor was either genuinely concerned about the escalating situation, or she was an exceptionally skilled manipulator preparing a more sophisticated attack. What do you think? He asked Vivian, showing her Eleanor's response. I think, Vivian said slowly, that Eleanor has spent her career cleaning up Charles's messes without ever having to look directly at his victims. Seeing me in that hospital bed, pregnant and traumatized, might have been the first time she understood the real cost of her brother's behavior. Dorothy moved to the window and peered through the blinds at the surrounding woods. Or it might be that their private investigators have found something they can use against us, and she wants to deliver the threats personally. Either way, Clay replied, we need more information about what they are planning. Jack and Danny should have their background research completed by tomorrow morning. If Eleanor wants to negotiate, I want to know exactly what leverage we have before I sit down at that table. His phone rang again, this time with a call from Detective Walsh. Mr. Grace, I have some updates on the case that you and your sister need to hear. Are you somewhere secure where we can talk? Yes, we are at a safe location. You are on speaker with Vivian and my mother. Good. First, the district attorney's office has formally filed charges against Charles' domestic violence, assault in the third degree, and public endangerment. However, his legal team has already filed motions to suppress the video evidence, claiming it violates his privacy rights. Can they do that? Vivian asked, her voice tight with concern. Not easily, but they can delay the trial and create procedural complications. More concerning is that someone has been investigating you, Mrs. Whitmore. Private investigators have been asking questions about your employment history, your medical records, your family's financial situation. Clay felt the familiar cold focus of combat operations settling over him. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests they are building a character assassination case, depression treatment, anxiety medication, any history of emotional instability that they can use to claim you are an unreliable witness. They are also looking into your relationship with your brother, trying to build a narrative that he has undue influence over your decisions. Dorothy sat down heavily, the implications of coordinated legal warfare hitting her with full force. They are going to put my daughter on trial instead of their son. That is their plan, Walsh confirmed. But here is what they do not know. We have been conducting our own investigation into Charles's background. Mrs. Whitmore, your husband has a sealed juvenile record for assault. 2 incidents when he was 16 and 17, both involving violence against girlfriends. The revelation hit Vivian like a physical blow. He told me I was his first serious relationship. He said he had never loved anyone enough to lose his temper before. He lied, Walsh continued. We also found records of 3 domestic violence calls to his residence during his first marriage. No charges were filed because the wife refused to cooperate, but the pattern is clear. Clay absorbed this information with grim satisfaction. Detective, how did you get access to sealed records? Let us just say that some judges are more concerned with justice than family connections. The point is, Charles has a documented history of violence against women that his family has been covering up for over 20 years. Does his legal team know you have this information? Vivian asked. Not yet, but they will when we file our response to their motions. Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to understand something. This case is not going away quietly. Charles's family has the resources to make this a long, expensive, and public fight. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and stress? Vivian looked around the safe house where she had taken refuge from her own husband, then down at her pregnant belly, where her child grew despite the trauma and chaos surrounding them both. When she spoke, her voice carried a strength that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. Detective Walsh, I have spent 3 years being afraid of what Charles might do if I spoke up about his abuse. I have hidden bruises, made excuses, and convinced myself that his violence was somehow my fault. But I will not raise my child in that same environment of fear and lies. She stood up slowly, one hand supporting her belly while the other reached for Clay's arm. Charles made his choice when he hit me in public. His family made their choice when they decided to attack my credibility rather than address his behavior. Now I am making my choice. I will testify against him. I will expose his pattern of abuse, and I will make sure our child grows up knowing that violence has consequences. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the determination in her voice. Clay felt a surge of pride mixed with protective concern as he realized his sister had found the courage that would carry her through whatever came next. In that case, Walsh said, you should know that Charles violated the restraining order this afternoon. He was seen outside the hospital where you were staying, and he made several attempts to contact your former employer to discuss your emotional stability. We have issued a warrant for his arrest. The news should have been reassuring, but Clay understood that cornering a dangerous man often made him more unpredictable rather than less. Detective, what kind of security can you provide while this case moves forward? Patrol units will increase their presence around your known locations, but with his resources, Charles could hire private security or investigators that operate outside our jurisdiction. Your best protection is staying somewhere he cannot find you and avoiding predictable patterns. After Walsh ended the call, the three family members sat in the safe house living room, contemplating the reality of their situation. They were at war with one of the most powerful families on the West Coast, fighting a battle that would determine not only Charles's fate, but the kind of world Vivian's child would inherit. Clay, Vivian said quietly, I need you to promise me something before you meet with Eleanor tomorrow. What is it? Promise me that whatever information your friends have discovered, whatever leverage you think we have, you will not use it to hurt innocent people. Eleanor may be Charles's sister, but she is not responsible for his choices. Their parents, their extended family, their employees, they do not deserve to be destroyed because of what Charles did. Clay considered her request, weighing his protective instincts against her moral clarity. Viv, these people are trying to destroy your reputation and credibility to protect a man who hit you while you were pregnant. They are not innocent bystanders. Maybe not, she replied. But if we fight their cruelty with our own cruelty, if we become the kind of people who destroy others to get what we want, then Charles wins anyway. He will have turned us into versions of himself. The wisdom in her words hit Clay with unexpected force. In 8 years of military service, he had learned to identify and neutralize threats with maximum efficiency. But his pregnant sister, recovering from domestic violence in a safe house, was teaching him something about moral courage that all his training had not prepared him for. I promise, he said finally. We fight back, but we fight clean. We protect you and the baby, but we do not become the monsters we are fighting against. Outside the safe house, hidden cameras recorded their conversation, while private investigators updated their files on the Grace family's location and security arrangements. The war was escalating, and both sides were preparing for a confrontation that would determine much more than the outcome of a single criminal case. In his mansion across town, Charles Edward Whitmore III sat in his study, scrolling through social media coverage of his public humiliation while planning his next move. The restraining order and criminal charges were merely legal inconveniences that his family's lawyers would eventually overcome. But Clayton Grace had made this personal by turning his wife against him in front of the entire world. That was a problem that required a more permanent solution than anything the courts could provide. The real war was just beginning. The Coastal Community Center's main conference room felt like neutral territory. Its bland institutional decor and fluorescent lighting stripped of any advantage for either side. Clay arrived exactly on time, having spent the morning reviewing the intelligence files that Jack and Danny had compiled on the Whitmore family. What they had discovered was enough to shift the balance of power dramatically, if used correctly. Eleanor Blake Whitmore was already waiting at the conference table, looking every inch the successful corporate lawyer in her tailored suit and perfect makeup. But Clay's trained eye caught the subtle signs of stress, the slight tremor in her hands, the tension around her eyes, the way she gripped her briefcase like a shield. Mr. Grace, thank you for agreeing to meet, she said as he took the seat across from her. I hope your sister's recovering well from her medical emergency. She is stable, but the doctors are concerned about ongoing stress affecting her pregnancy, Clay replied neutrally, which is why I am hoping this conversation will lead to your brother accepting responsibility for his actions and leaving my family alone. Eleanor opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder, her movements precise but lacking their earlier confidence. Mr. Grace, I have been practicing law for 15 years. I have handled crisis management for some of the most powerful families in the country, but I have never encountered a situation quite like this one. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. When I watched the video of what happened at your restaurant, I told myself it was an isolated incident. Stress, alcohol, a moment of poor judgment that could be explained and managed. But then I spoke with Charles about his marriage, and I learned some things that changed my perspective significantly. Clay remained silent, letting her continue while assessing whether this was genuine remorse or sophisticated manipulation. My brother has been lying to our family for years about his relationship with your sister. He told us she was emotionally unstable, prone to dramatic outbursts, possibly suffering from pregnancy-related mental health issues. He said she had been making false accusations about their marriage to gain sympathy and leverage. Eleanor's voice dropped as she continued. But when I had my investigators do a thorough background check on Vivian, they found no evidence of mental instability, no history of false accusations, no pattern of manipulative behavior. What they found was a young woman with an exemplary work record, strong family relationships, and no previous contact with law enforcement. So you realize your brother had been lying to you, Clay observed. More than that, I realized he had been lying to himself. When I confronted him with the evidence that contradicted his version of events, his response was terrifying. He became enraged that I would question his authority over his wife. He said that what happened in his marriage was nobody's business, including mine. Eleanor reached into her folder and removed a small digital recorder. Mr. Grace, I am going to play you something that I recorded during that conversation. I want you to understand what kind of man my brother really is and why I believe your sister is in genuine danger. She pressed play, and Charles's voice filled the conference room with chilling clarity. Eleanor, you need to understand something about marriage. When a woman takes your name, she becomes your responsibility. If she steps out of line, if she embarrasses you, if she threatens everything you have built, you correct the problem. Vivian has forgotten her place, and now she thinks she can destroy me with help from her war hero brother. Clay listened to the recording with the controlled attention of someone trained to gather intelligence under pressure. Charles's words revealed not just contempt for his wife, but a fundamental belief that violence was an acceptable tool for maintaining control. The recording gets worse, Eleanor warned, fast-forwarding to another section. Charles's voice continued. I do not care what it costs or how long it takes. I want Vivian destroyed, her reputation, her credibility, her ability to function in society. I want her brother's restaurant shut down and his military record investigated for any misconduct we can exploit. And if legal methods do not work, there are other ways to solve problems permanently. The implicit threat was unmistakable. Clay felt the familiar cold focus of combat operations settling over him as he realized that Charles was planning escalation beyond legal warfare. When did you record this? Clay asked. Last night, when I went to his house to discuss settlement options. Mr. Grace, my brother is not just refusing to accept responsibility for what he did. He is planning to retaliate against your entire family in ways that go far beyond courtroom tactics. Eleanor's professional composure finally cracked, revealing genuine fear beneath her corporate lawyer facade. I have spent my career protecting my family's interests, sometimes by methods I am not proud of, but I will not be part of a conspiracy to harm a pregnant woman and her unborn child. Clay studied her face, reading the body language and vocal patterns that indicated either genuine distress or exceptionally skilled deception. Ms. Blake Whitmore, what exactly are you proposing? I want to help you stop my brother before he does something that destroys both our families irreparably. In exchange, I am hoping you will consider a resolution that does not involve exposing every mistake the Whitmore family has made over the past 3 generations. The negotiation was interrupted by Clay's phone buzzing with a text from Travis. Emergency at the safe house. Armed men approach the perimeter. Vivian and Dorothy are secure but shaken. Police en route. Clay showed the message to Eleanor, whose face went pale as she realized the implications. "This is what I was afraid of," she whispered. "Charles said that legal methods might not be sufficient." "Call him," Clay ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command decisions. "Call him right now and tell him to stand down whatever operation he has initiated." Eleanor fumbled for her phone with trembling hands. "Charles, this is Eleanor. I need you to call off whatever you have set in motion regarding the Grace family. We are in negotiations, and any further escalation will destroy everything." Charles's voice came through the phone speaker with cold fury. "Eleanor, you seem to have forgotten which side you are on. I do not negotiate with people who threaten my family's reputation. I eliminate them. Charles, if you hurt that woman or her child, I will personally ensure that you face federal charges for domestic terrorism and conspiracy to commit violence. I will turn over every piece of evidence I have collected about your behavior to federal authorities." "You would not dare," Charles replied, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Try me," Eleanor said with steel in her voice. "I may be your sister, but I am also an officer of the court. I will not be complicit in violence against innocent people." The line went dead, leaving Clay and Eleanor staring at each other across the conference table, while the reality of their situation crystallized. Charles had moved beyond legal warfare into territory that threatened everyone involved. "Mr. Grace," Eleanor said quietly, "I think we need to stop thinking of this as a negotiation and start thinking of it as a crisis intervention. My brother has crossed lines that cannot be uncrossed." Clay was already standing, his mind shifting into tactical mode as he prepared to return to the safe house and assess the threat level. "Ms. Blake Whitmore, if you genuinely want to help my family, you need to understand that your brother has just declared war on a decorated Navy SEAL who will do whatever is necessary to protect his pregnant sister." "I understand," Eleanor replied. "And Mr. Grace, the intelligence files you mentioned having on my family, I think it might be time to use them. Charles needs to understand that he is not the only one with access to devastating information." As Clay headed for the door, Eleanor called after him one final time. "Mr. Grace, please do not let this situation turn you into the kind of person who solves problems with violence. Your sister would never forgive herself if protecting her cost you your humanity." Clay paused at the doorway, considering her words. "Ms. Blake Whitmore, my sister has already been hurt by someone who chose violence over accountability. I will not let that happen again, regardless of the cost to my humanity or anything else." The drive back to the safe house took 20 minutes that felt like hours, with Clay's phone providing constant updates from Travis, Danny, and Jack about the security situation. By the time he arrived, the immediate threat had been neutralized, but the message was clear: Charles was prepared to escalate beyond anything they had anticipated. Vivian was waiting for him in the living room, her face pale but her voice steady as she described the men who had approached the property. "They were not trying to break in," she said. "They were making sure we knew they could find us anywhere we tried to hide." Clay knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his while making a promise that would define everything that followed. "Viv, I swear to you that this ends now. Charles has made his final threat against this family." The war between the Grace family and Charles Whitmore was about to reach its conclusion, and only one side would walk away intact. 3 months later, Vivian Grace Morrison held her daughter for the first time in the maternity ward of Coastal Regional Medical Center, surrounded by family who had fought a war to ensure this moment could happen safely. Isabella Grace Morrison, named for Dorothy's mother, and carrying the Grace family name by choice, weighed 6 pounds, 8 ounces, and announced her arrival with the strong, clear cry of someone who would never doubt her right to be heard. "She is perfect," Dorothy whispered, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter cradle her granddaughter. "After everything we went through, she is absolutely perfect." Clay stood beside the hospital bed, his expression soft with wonder as he looked down at his niece. The past 3 months had transformed him in ways that combat never had, teaching him that some battles were won not through violence, but through courage, persistence, and the power of truth finally spoken aloud. "She looks like you did as a baby," he told Vivian, gently stroking the infant's tiny fist. "Same stubborn chin, same determined expression. I think Charles is going to have his hands full if he ever gets supervised visitation." The mention of Charles brought a momentary shadow across Vivian's face. but it passed quickly. The criminal trial had concluded 6 weeks earlier with guilty verdicts on all charges: domestic violence, assault, criminal threatening, and violation of a restraining order. Charles Edward Whitmore III was currently serving 18 months in minimum security prison, followed by 5 years of probation and mandatory anger management counseling. More importantly, the civil case had been settled with terms that ensured Vivian's financial independence and Isabella's future security. The Whitmore Family Trust had established a fund for the child's education and medical expenses, while Vivian received enough alimony to remain home with her daughter for the first 2 years if she chose. "Any word from Eleanor?" Vivian asked, adjusting Isabella's blanket with the careful movements of a new mother still learning to trust her instincts. "She sent flowers and a card," Dorothy replied, indicating an elaborate arrangement of white roses and baby's breath that dominated one corner of the room. "The card says she hopes you and Isabella will have the peaceful, happy life you both deserve." Eleanor Blake Whitmore had proven to be an unexpected ally during the final weeks of the legal proceedings. Her testimony about Charles's escalating threats and her willingness to provide recorded evidence of his violent intentions had been crucial in securing his conviction. The experience had cost her professionally. Several corporate clients had dropped her firm after the scandal, but she had told the prosecutor that some things mattered more than billable hours. "Travis brought lunch from the restaurant," Clay said, indicating a basket of carefully prepared meals designed for new mothers. "And Jack and Danny wanted me to tell you that Isabella officially has 3 honorary uncles who will teach her everything from motorcycle maintenance to advanced tactical planning when she gets older." Vivian laughed, the sound light and genuine in a way that had been missing from her voice for years. "Please tell them that my daughter will be learning age-appropriate skills like reading, mathematics, and how to recognize healthy relationships with people who treat her with respect." "We will compromise," Clay replied with a grin. "Reading and mathematics first, motorcycle maintenance when she turns 16? Dr. Chen entered the room with the brisk efficiency that Vivian had come to associate with excellent medical care and genuine concern for her patient's well-being. "Mrs. Morrison, I have your discharge paperwork ready. Isabella's pediatrician will want to see her within 48 hours, and you have a follow-up appointment with me next week." The name change had been finalized a month earlier, with Vivian legally returning to her maiden name and ensuring that Isabella would carry the Grace family legacy rather than the Whitmore burden. It had been a symbolic victory that felt more significant than any legal judgment. "Dr. Chen," Vivian said as she signed the discharge forms, "I wanted to thank you for everything you did during those first terrible days. If you had not taken my medical emergency seriously, if you had not protected me from Charles's lawyers." "Mrs. Morrison, protecting mothers and babies from domestic violence is part of my job," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "But I am proud that you found the courage to protect yourself and your daughter. Too many women in your situation never escape." As they prepared to leave the hospital, Clay's phone buzzed with a message from Detective Walsh. "Wanted you to know that Charles filed an appeal this morning. Legal experts say it has virtually no chance of success, but thought you should be aware." Clay showed the message to Vivian, who read it with the calm attention of someone who had learned to face bad news without panic. "He is never going to stop completely." "Is he?" "Probably not," Clay admitted. "But he is facing 18 months of incarceration to think about whether continued harassment is worth additional legal consequences. And now that his pattern of violence is part of the public record, any future incidents will be taken much more seriously by law enforcement." Dorothy helped Vivian into the wheelchair required for hospital discharge, then carefully positioned Isabella in her arms for the ride to the elevator. "Besides, he will have other things to worry about. I heard his family's investment firm is facing SEC investigation for some questionable accounting practices that came to light during the trial." Clay had not asked Jack and Danny what information they had provided to federal authorities, but he suspected that Charles's legal troubles extended far beyond domestic violence charges. The Whitmore family's decades of covering up problems and manipulating the system had finally attracted the attention of investigators who could not be bought or intimidated. "Where to now?" Dorothy asked as they reached the hospital's main entrance, where Travis waited with Clay's truck. "Home," Vivian said simply. "Our home." The house was a modest 3-bedroom craftsman in a quiet neighborhood 20 minutes from the restaurant, close enough for Clay to visit regularly, but far enough from Charles's usual territory to provide psychological distance. Vivian had chosen it herself, using money from the settlement to make the down payment and establish the kind of independent life she had never been allowed to imagine during her marriage. "The nursery looks amazing," she said as Clay carried Isabella upstairs to see her new room for the first time. Dorothy and several friends from the restaurant had spent weeks transforming the space into a peaceful sanctuary decorated in soft greens and yellows, with a mural of ocean waves that reminded everyone of the view from Coastal Kitchen. "Travis insisted on the bookshelf," Clay said, indicating a wall-mounted shelf already filled with children's books. "He said Isabella needs to grow up understanding that knowledge is power, and that reading gives you the ability to travel anywhere and become anyone you want to be." Vivian settled into the comfortable rocking chair beside Isabella's crib, finally allowing herself to believe that this peaceful scene was real and permanent. "Clay, I need to tell you something I should have said months ago." "What is it?" "Thank you. Not just for protecting us, though you did that. Thank you for believing me when I finally found the courage to tell the truth. Thank you for refusing to let Charles and his family convince me that his violence was my fault. Thank you for showing Isabella, even before she was born, what it looks like when men use their strength to protect instead of harm." Clay knelt beside the rocking chair, his hand gently resting on Isabella's tiny blanket. "Viv, you saved yourself. I just made sure you had a safe place to land while you found your courage again." "Maybe," she replied. "But I want Isabella to grow up knowing that she has an uncle who would move mountains to keep her safe, and that she should never settle for anything less than a partner who treats her with the same respect and protection." As the afternoon sun streamed through the nursery windows, casting gentle light across the 3 generations of the Grace family, Vivian finally understood what Charles had tried so hard to destroy: the unbreakable bonds of people who choose to love and protect each other instead of controlling and diminishing. Isabella stirred in her arms, dark eyes opening to focus on her mother's face with the intense attention of someone seeing the world for the first time. In that gaze, Vivian saw infinite possibility, a future free from the fear and shame that had defined her marriage, and the promise that her daughter would grow up knowing her own worth. "Welcome to the world, baby girl," she whispered. "You are going to do amazing things." Outside, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its waves carrying away the last remnants of a painful chapter and washing the shore clean for whatever came next. At Coastal Kitchen, the dinner crowd gathered to celebrate another successful evening of Clay's culinary artistry. Unaware that their chef had just begun the most important job of his life, teaching his niece that she deserved a world where love meant safety, where family meant protection, and where strength was measured not by the ability to control others, but by the courage to stand up for what was right. Charles Edward Whitmore III would serve his sentence and face whatever consequences his choices had earned. But in a quiet nursery overlooking a peaceful neighborhood, 3 generations of the Grace family had already won the only victory that truly mattered: the right to build a future free from fear, filled with love and defined by the unshakable certainty that some things, family, truth, and the protection of the innocent, were worth fighting for with everything you had. The war was over, the healing had begun, and Isabella Grace Morrison slept peacefully in her mother's arms, dreaming of a world where she would never doubt her right to be safe, loved, and free.